In the shadows of myth and reality, monsters stir. From ancient legends to modern nightmares, we explore the creatures that haunt our stories, and sometimes, our lives. Welcome to Among Monsters podcast, where the line between man and monsters is thinner than you think.
Cult of Blood, Marcus Wesson's House of Horrors. Good evening and welcome back to Among Monsters. Tonight we navigate the darkest corridors of human depravity, where the sanctity of family was perverted into a horrifying testament to one man's absolute control. In the annals of American crime, few cases shock the conscience quite like the events that unfolded in Fresno, California, in the spring of 2004. A tragedy that unveiled the monstrous legacy of Marcus Wesson, a man who transformed himself from an obscure drifter into the architect of an unspeakable domestic nightmare. The world awoke to the name Marcus Wesson not through acts of heroism or contribution, but through the chilling discovery of 9 bodies, meticulously arranged in a modest suburban home. 7 children and 2 young women, all members of his own kin, many bearing his biological imprint as both father and grandfather, lay dead. This was no impulsive act of violence. It was the culmination of decades of systematic psychological and physical enslavement, a twisted theology forged in isolation, and a reign of terror masquerading as divine order. What transpired within those walls was not merely murder, but a meticulously orchestrated act of spiritual terrorism, generational abuse, and ritualized incest, where one man unilaterally declared himself God over a captive kingdom. This is the story of Marcus Wesson, often referred to as the vampire father of Fresno, a narrative that demands our attention, not for its sensationalism, but for its profound and disturbing insights into the insidious nature of unchecked power and cultic manipulation. Genesis of a predator, early life and influences. To understand the monster, one must first examine the man. Marcus DeLong Wesson was born on August 22, 1946, in Kansas, into a family environment marked by profound instability. His early life was a crucible of neglect and rigid, fear-based religious indoctrination. His father, Benjamin Wesson, was an alcoholic whose presence was sporadic and often violent, ultimately abandoning the family when Marcus was young. His mother, Carrie, a devout Seventh-day Adventist, sought solace and control in a severe interpretation of Christian doctrine, raising her children under the constant specter of damnation and divine wrath. This duality of chaos and rigid control, the unpredictability of a violent father juxtaposed with the unyielding strictures of an authoritarian faith, would deeply scar young Marcus and chillingly become foundational elements of the tyrannical regime he would later impose on his own family. In 1966, Wesson entered the U.S. Army, serving as a medical orderly. His 2 years of service, primarily stationed in Europe, offered a temporary escape from his fractured past, though he never saw combat. Upon his discharge in 1968, he returned to the United States adrift, lacking direction or a discernible career path. He drifted through various locations before eventually settling in California, drawn perhaps by the countercultural movements of the era, though his own journey would take a far darker turn. It was in California, sometime in the mid-1970s, that Marcus Wesson met Rosemary Solorio, a single mother with several children. What began as a seemingly innocuous relationship soon devolved into something sinister. Wesson moved into Solorio's home, and it wasn't long before his predatory gaze fixed upon her vulnerable 8-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. This marked the true beginning of his descent into overt criminality and the systematic construction of his personal empire of abuse. Wesson meticulously groomed Elizabeth, isolating her and eroding her sense of self. He subjected her to repeated rapes, and by the time she was a mere 14 years old, he forced her into a common-law marriage, despite being 34 himself. Elizabeth, in her agonizing youth, became his first long-term victim, bearing him 10 children over the subsequent years. Tragically, she would not be the last. The architecture of a cult, isolation, incest, and a self-made god. Wesson's depravity escalated. As his control over Elizabeth solidified, he began to target other young, impressionable females within his burgeoning extended family. His own daughters, nieces, and other relatives. The pattern was horrifyingly consistent: grooming, sexual abuse, and impregnation. By the early 2000s, Marcus Wesson had meticulously constructed an insular, incestuous household that functioned with the absolute rigidity of a cult. He demanded to be addressed as master. His word was law, his desires, divine decree. To enforce his authority and provide a twisted justification for his actions, Wesson penned his own Bible, a handwritten tome filled with convoluted, self-serving prophecies and theological deviations. In this horrifying doctrine, Jesus Christ was reimagined not as a savior, but as a vampire, and blood, particularly the bloodline he was purportedly purifying through incest, was deemed sacred. Death, in his perverted scripture, was not an end, but a divine transition, a pathway to ultimate holiness. Wesson convinced his captive family that he was God's chosen prophet, tasked with leading them, purifying their bloodline, and possessing absolute dominion over their lives, and, chillingly, their deaths. To maintain this absolute control, Wesson systematically severed his family's ties to the outside world. The children were denied formal education, kept from schools, and rarely, if ever, allowed to interact with anyone beyond the family's immediate orbit. For years, they lived a nomadic existence, dwelling in squalid conditions, in tents, abandoned boats, or dilapidated homes often devoid of electricity or running water. This constant transience served to reinforce their isolation and dependence on Wesson. When they finally settled into a house at 767 North Park Avenue in central Fresno, their strange existence became more noticeable to the outside world. Neighbors reported peculiar observations: children dressed in dark, flowing robes, windows perpetually covered to obscure the interior, and an eerie silence emanating from a home where the sounds of childish laughter should have resonated. Inside, Wesson's authority was absolute and unquestioned. Girls were not merely daughters. They were groomed from infancy to become his future wives. He dictated every aspect of their existence: who could speak, when they could eat, even who was permitted to look in a mirror. Central to his control was a chilling concept he termed the arrangement, a purported suicide pact designed to preserve the family's holiness should the external world ever threaten to dismantle his carefully constructed dominion. Some of the young women and girls were made to sleep in antique coffins, which Wesson sacrilegiously referred to as holy beds, further blurring the lines between life and death, normal and perverse. He meticulously trained his victims to be unconditionally loyal, even unto death, fostering a psychological dependence so profound that many were incapable of conceiving a world outside his oppressive shadow. The unraveling, a custody dispute, and the day of discovery. Despite Wesson's iron grip, glimmers of defiance began to emerge. Over time, some of Wesson's nieces, young women he had abused and impregnated, managed to escape the household. They carried with them not only the scars of their trauma, but also children fathered by Wesson. By early 2004, these courageous survivors, now armed with the desperate hope of reclaiming their children, began to act. On Friday, March 12, 2004, the facade of normalcy shattered. Two of Wesson's adult nieces, accompanied by other relatives, arrived at the Fresno home with a clear, unequivocal demand: the return of their daughters, who remained under Wesson's control. The ensuing confrontation escalated, prompting a call to the Fresno Police Department. The initial report was logged as a child custody dispute, a bureaucratic classification that utterly failed to capture the grotesque reality unfolding within. When officers arrived at 767 North Park Avenue, the scene was tense. Marcus Wesson himself appeared at the front door, disarmingly calm and compliant. He assured the officers he would go inside to retrieve the children. This moment, seemingly cooperative, was in fact a chilling act of final manipulation. Wesson disappeared into the rear of the house, and moments later, the dreadful sound of gunshots pierced the suburban quiet. Realizing the gravity of the situation, police officers immediately stormed the residence. What they discovered inside transcended comprehension, confronting them with a scene of unimaginable horror. In a back bedroom, 9 bodies were found piled atop one another, their blood soaking the carpet. The victims ranged from infants to young adults. Some were babies, barely a year old. Others were school-aged children, and 2 were young women. Each had been shot once, execution style, through the eye or the head. The victims were identified as Sabrina Wesson, 25 years old, Elizabeth Wesson, 17 years old, Ilabelle, 8 years old, Aviv, 7 years old, Jonathan, 7 years old, Ethan, 4 years old, Marche, 1 year old, Sedona, 1 year old, Jeva, 1 year old. The sickening reality that emerged during the subsequent investigation was that nearly all the victims were biologically connected to Marcus Wesson, serving as both his children and, through incest, his grandchildren. Multiple victims were the tragic offspring of his incestuous relationships. Their deaths were the horrifying conclusion of either a meticulously planned mass execution carried out by Wesson himself, or a coerced murder-suicide, orchestrated and manipulated by him in his final act of control. Marcus Wesson was apprehended outside the home, covered in blood, yet disturbingly silent and passive. His demeanor suggested a man whose actions, no matter how heinous, were part of a larger, predetermined plan. his arrangement reaching its horrific crescendo. The trial and lingering shadows. The trial that followed in 2005 was a surreal and emotionally grueling ordeal. Wesson's defense team attempted to argue that his daughter, Severina Wesson, had been the perpetrator, claiming she had killed the children and then herself. Indeed, Severina's DNA was found on the .22 caliber Ruger pistol recovered at the scene. However, the prosecution meticulously dismantled this defense, presenting an overwhelming case that illuminated Wesson's decades-long pattern of abuse and manipulation. Regardless of who pulled the final trigger, the prosecution argued, Marcus Wesson was undeniably the architect of the crime. He had crafted the twisted theology, constructed the insidious doctrine, and designed the apocalypse that culminated in the mass deaths. He had spent decades systematically conditioning his family to believe that death at his command was not just an escape, but an act of salvation. On June 17, 2005, after careful deliberation, Marcus Wesson was convicted of 9 counts of first-degree murder, alongside an additional 14 counts of sexual abuse, rape, and incest. He was subsequently sentenced to death and remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison to this day, exhibiting no discernible remorse for his unspeakable acts. His chilling lack of empathy underscores the profound narcissism and delusional self-importance that fueled his reign of terror. The house on North Park Avenue, where such profound evil took root and flowered, was eventually demolished. The lot remains empty, a scarred void in the urban landscape of Fresno. The collective memory of the community could not bear for anything to be rebuilt on such hallowed, haunted ground. The air above that place, locals will tell you, still feels thick with the echoes of past horrors, heavy with the weight of unspeakable tragedy. The surviving members of the Wesson family, those who managed to escape his clutches or who were spared that final horrific day, have scattered. Some have changed their names, seeking anonymity and a fresh start, far from the shadow of their monstrous patriarch. Others have courageously chosen to speak out, sharing their harrowing experiences to shed light on the dangers of cultic abuse and family isolation. All grapple with the impossible burden of reconciling their past, that their own father, their own grandfather, the man they were taught to worship as a divine figure, was, in truth, the source of their profound destruction. These children had never known another world. Some had rarely, if ever, left the confines of the house. Some were forbidden from seeing their own reflections, denied even the basic right of self-recognition. They were raised to believe that death was beautiful, a gateway to a higher state, and that love was whatever their master declared it to be, a terrifying perversion of the most fundamental human emotion. The enduring question, defining the monster. The case of Marcus Wesson is not a simple narrative of mental illness or impulsive violence. It is a stark, chilling exposé on the devastating consequences of unchecked power, absolute isolation, and profound religious abuse. It illustrates the terrifying efficacy of grooming so complete, so pervasive, that it can convincingly masquerade as genuine belief and unwavering devotion. Marcus Wesson was not an anomaly in the abstract. He was the devastating outcome of circumstances where a single individual was allowed to wield absolute power over others, untroubled by external scrutiny or intervention. He weaponized fatherhood, transforming it into a tool of enslavement. He twisted faith, contorting it into a prison. And in his wake, he left behind not only 9 innocent bodies, but also more than a dozen survivors, forever marked by their ordeal, still desperately striving to define themselves outside the hell he meticulously created. So we are compelled to ask the question once more. What truly constitutes a monster? Is it merely the archetype from lore, a man lurking in the shadows with a knife, an alien creature from another world? Or is it, as the case of Marcus Wesson so terrifyingly demonstrates, a man in a robe clutching a self-made Bible who calls you his daughter by day and his wife by night? The uncomfortable truth is that monsters are not always mythical beings. They are not always found in the darkest corners of fantasy. Sometimes they grow in plain sight within the very fabric of society, in a family, in a home, under the insidious flag of self-righteousness and purported divine mandate. And when they are finally exposed, often too late, the rest of us are left to grapple with the chilling question: how did no one see it sooner? This has been Among Monsters. I'm Damien Vale. Until next time, stay vigilant, question what you see, and never assume the monster lives only outside your door.
Thank you for listening to Among Monsters podcast. Find more episodes of Among Monsters podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker, or anywhere premium podcasts exist. Email us at amongmonsterspodcast@gmail.com.